Before we get into anything, I just want to give a quick trigger warning for police brutality and insanity, and less than kind portrayals of the criminally insane. Okay, let's go. So, Prodigal Son is a show that filmed over 2019-2020 and aired over 2020. Its first season was cut short by the pandemic, and they ended up making it 2 episodes shorter than they had intended, but still managed to finish its arc for that season. I don't really want to talk about Prodigal Son as a whole. I want to talk specifically about Season 2, Episode 1, which aired last week. But to get there, we kind of need to get a little bit of background in about this show, because I can't really start on Season 2, Episode 1 and not tell you about the previous season. So, Part 1, a plot summary. So, Malcolm Bright is a profiler, because, you know, the police use those all the time in real life, who is the son of a famous serial killer called the Surgeon, Martin Wheatley, who is played by the incomparable Michael Sheen. His sister is a reporter and his mum is insanely rich. She is part of a very wealthy American family, and more than once in the first season she and her family are referred to as American royalty, which is interesting given that the Americans, you know, had a little bit of a skirmish about not wanting to be ruled by royalty, but this show has a little bit of an obsession with talking about American royalty, whatever that means. As a kid, Malcolm is the one who basically helps the police find the surgeon, because he figures out that his dad is a serial killer and he calls the police. The main policeman who arrives, who's the policeman he spoke to, is Officer Gill, who in present day, 25 years later, is the police captain that Malcolm works with. And he also works with 3 other main characters, who are 2 police detectives and the Abby of the show, as in Abby from NCIS, not me, Idrissa. So, a little bit more about these characters. Gil fancies Malcolm's mum. We also have JT, who is another detective who, you know, thinks Malcolm is a bit weird, but ultimately gets on with him and lets him do his thing. And Danny Powell, who is a female detective, who also has a similar kind of relationship with Malcolm, of not quite trusting him because he is a bit bonkers and unpredictable. And this whole show has a thing with talking about, I guess, the genetics of being a murderer, and that Malcolm's dad was a murderer, so maybe he's a murderer too. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to that one. And we also have Dr. Idrissa, who I mentioned is the Abby of the show. She is big wet for Malcolm and frequently flirts with him through the medium of talking about interesting murder techniques. And is kind of an awkward character, but in that sort of funny way. She kind of doesn't really fit with the tone of the show. Put a pin in that as well. We will come back to that idea. But those are the main characters, including as well with his mum, who is rich and only sort of 25 years later is kind of finally managing to get her foot in the door back with American high society after she was shunned because her husband murdered 30-odd people. Anyway, as I just mentioned there, the tone of the show is a mess. The best way to encapsulate what the tone of the show is like and its inherent messiness is the moment in the pilot episode that made me decide that I was going to watch this show because up until that point it was kind of, you know, a procedural cop drama, but with crazy people, and I wasn't really feeling it. But episode 1, season 1, they find a man who is handcuffed to a chair with a bomb on it. The bomb is ticking down. They've got no way of getting him out of those handcuffs without triggering the bomb. So Malcolm, our main character and apparent good guy, cuts this man's hand off with an axe, which is pretty shocking and horrible, and honestly something that you don't tend to see the heroes of these shows doing. But he cuts this man's hand off, then we cut to outside, and they got out the building before the bomb went off, and the man who's had his hand cut off is off with the ambulance people, the paramedics, and Malcolm, holding the cooler box that has this man's hand cut off in, turns to Powell and says, "Excuse me, I've got to give this guy a hand." A mess is the tone. The other problem with the tone is kind of in Martin's character, the serial killer, the surgeon, because he's this, you know, brutal serial killer, but does genuinely seem to love his kids and constantly wants to be involved in their lives because, at least what he says, is that he wants to be a father figure to his son and his daughter, be part of the family. This is carried pretty much entirely by Michael Sheen being a wonderful actor, even if his American accent does kind of drop in and out from time to time. But I can't do one at all, so I'm not here to have a go at award-winning actor Michael Sheen. So that's kind of where you need to know, what you need to know about Prodigal Son. It's procedural crime drama, the tone is a mess, and everyone's crazy. So, Series 1, Episode 2, which is what I wanted to talk about today. I will give you a quick breakdown and then we will move into what it is specifically that we need to talk about here. So, the episode opens on a ledge. A man is walking along the ledge and then he bumps into Malcolm, who's also on the ledge. Initially, obviously, a man on a ledge on a high up building in New York, you think this man's going to kill himself. This is where Malcolm says, "Oh, I've had a really tough year." Well, everyone has. Which, COVID mention, ? We'll come back to that. He and this man on the ledge, who turns out to be some sort of serial killer because everybody is in New York City, they have a little fight. They nearly fall, but it turns out Malcolm's got a harness on and they've got a rope on the inside, but he's dangling the villain off the edge of the ledge. And he talks to the villain about how maybe what the best thing to do is to let him go and let him die, because he's a murderer. Which, well, he's going to be in police custody once you bring him in, and he's not going to get away with it because, you know, it's him when you have stone cold evidence, and obviously he doesn't kill the guy. But that's the tone for this episode, I guess. He then gets a call from his dad, who says that he is being moved back to the prison for the criminally insane after having spent a stint in Gen Pop. He says on the phone that he's getting this privilege back because he stopped COVID from ravaging the prisons, and this is like a reward for him. Quick thing, how on earth did an inmate who was a disgraced surgeon stop COVID ravaging the prison? Did he put in quarantine procedures as a prisoner somehow? Did he develop a vaccine in prison somehow? Doesn't matter. He's a saviour. The people of that prison haven't all died, and he's allowed to go back to his cushy room with his bookcases and his journals back in the asylum for the criminally insane. Malcolm wakes up from a nightmare related to the big thing that happened at the end of season 1 that I'm not going to spoil in case you do want to watch this show, or you're starting to watch it and you don't want to be spoiled for that, and I don't want to spoil it either, and also it doesn't really matter, but he has a nightmare related to that big thing, and also Malcolm just constantly has nightmares anyway, because, you know, his dad's a serial killer, so he's a bit traumatised, and has lots of nightmares. Anyway, he wakes up, and his mum's in his flat, having let herself in, playing the piano and singing at him, and she mentions that she's had a lot of time in quarantine to practice the piano. He then gets a phone call to tell him that there's been a murder. A woman has been found outside of her massive palatial estate, because everyone in this show is rich as hell. And Idrissa tells everyone that they should hold on to their hats or heads while she shows them the murder method, and picks up her head that didn't previously look like it had been cut off, but it had been cut off in one clean hit. Malcolm profiles this as an execution. This is not a crime of passion because it was so planned, blah 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 blah. The plots of the murder being solved isn't really what I'm here to talk about, but I'll just bring you along. He uses his encyclopedic knowledge of murder weapons. This is Malcolm because he, you know, collects murder weapons, because that's a normal thing to do when your dad's a serial killer, I guess. And he pins correctly that this murder was committed with a guillotine. He also happens to know that the last time a guillotine came up for auction in the tri-state area was about 1996, but he doesn't know who bought it, so he needs to go toddle off to see his dad in crazy person prison to ask who it was. This is when we find out that Martin now has a roommate, because that's something you should do when you've got criminally insane people, is put them in the same room together so that they could potentially murder each other in the night. Pin. We're also going to be talking about this character. His name is Jerry in a bit more detail later on, so remember Jerry. Malcolm gets his father to tell him who bought the guillotine in 1996. I'm not entirely sure why his dad would know this, but he does. And he's this ridiculously wealthy, really eccentric English Robert Smith, if Robert Smith was really thin, still looking old guy, English chappie who bought the guillotine for sex purposes. And he's got a whole sex dungeon downstairs. Malcolm then finds that someone has been walled into the sex dungeon downstairs. No, the eccentric English guy is not the murderer, despite the fact that the guillotine murder happened in his house and there is a man walled up in the sex dungeon downstairs, but he's been out of the country for a little while, so it's not him. The person they find walled up downstairs is half-starved, half-mad, through having been trapped in the dark, chained to a wall for goodness knows how many days. And, you know, he's having a mental breakdown, basically, and he thinks Malcolm is the one who chained him downstairs. Malcolm uses this as an excuse and a way of getting this man to admit to a previous crime by basically insinuating that he's going to cut him up into little pieces if he doesn't tell him what he wants to know. Quick side note, if someone working for the police threatens you with bolt cutters and chainsaws whilst you're half crazed and you admit to a murder, that's not admissible evidence. Anyway, Malcolm finds out who the main killer is and who the man is who walled up this crazy guy in the sex dungeon. And this man has let himself into Malcolm's flat, and they have a bit of a fight. Anyway, whilst this is going on, the police proper, not just the profilers, are organising an attack on the flat so that they can get this murderer. And JT, who should have mentioned earlier, is a person of colour and is a plainclothes detective. When a bunch of the white beat cops show up, they presume that the man here who's just told them he's upstairs, you need to go there, is a criminal because he's a person of colour. This is the most realistic part of this episode. And then, and again, I know I gave a trigger warning earlier, but I am going to talk about an instance of police brutality that has the potential to be very triggering, so I just want to make sure that you're aware. He pins JT to the wall with his arm on his throat, and JT's sputtering and, losing air, and is basically going to have his windpipe crushed and died, so he shoves this guy off him. They all pull their guns on him. Looks like he's going to get shot, but then Detective Powell, also a person of colour, goes, no, and manages to get a badge out and says he's with us. So, back in the precinct, JT starts to spiral, convinced that this will be the end of his career because it is his word against the word of multiple white cops. Gil, who's been out of action because of the big thing that happened at end of season 1, don't want to spoil it, comes in and says, no, this will be fine, deal with this, I'm behind you, you're a great cop. And he says to JT that you are one of the good cops, which, despite what people say, do still exist. The end of episode. So there's a little bit to unpack here. So, Jerry Martin's new cellmate is, in the prison for the criminally insane, so we can presume that he's done some crimes. And he's not very verbal and appears to be sort of mentally a child. They show him watching cartoons, it's Roadrunner he's watching, and he's like transfixed and just kind of like, bouncy child excitement. Obviously he's a grown man, looks to be in about his mid-30s, maybe early 40s. And he is triggered at one point by Martin saying my boy, which he calls Malcolm a lot. My boy, you're my son, my boy, except in an American accent, but anyway. And this is some sort of trigger phrase for Jerry, who starts screaming and leaps out of bed, and he's held back by the belt that he has attached to the wall. And then we get to watch this insane person screaming and thrashing be belted down to the bed. Which is uncomfortable viewing, to say the least. Now, before we go any further, I would like you all to know that I am a crazy person. I have a bunch of mental health issues, and I find it rather galling when shows do this thing of having crazy people be murderers, and they're murderers because they're crazy. Right. Unfortunately, if I never watched anything that had crazy people being murderers because they're crazy, I wouldn't be able to watch most horror films, I wouldn't be able to watch most cop shows, I wouldn't be able to watch just about any crime drama at all, because this comes up a lot of people who are crazy and then they kill people because they're crazy. It's the Joker thing. I couldn't watch any Batman content. I couldn't play Arkham City, my favourite video game. Well, favourite, second to Tomb Raider 2, 1997, not Rise of the Tomb Raider. Fuck the Tomb Raider reboots. Anyway, it's not good. It's not kind. It is demonising the mentally ill, right? That's what it is. And especially given that Jerry is shown to be like, a childlike person, that whatever his undisclosed diagnosis is, he is mentally a child, is what they show us. Now, something that I didn't include in the episode breakdown because I wanted to save it for now because it's just a juicy pile of, oh no, is that when Jerry is triggered by him saying my boy, he, that makes Malcolm leave, and Martin's very, very set on being a father still, despite having murdered 30 odd people 25 years ago. He still really wants to be a father to his son. And because Jerry's meltdown makes Malcolm leave, he decides that the only thing he can do is kill him, because that'll help. So he rigs up a live wire that he then pushes along the floor and taps against the metal frame of Jerry's bed, turns on the wires, and gives him a huge electric shock for like a good 20-30 seconds, and the lights are all flickering and he's shouting and retching in the bed, and Martin thinks that this will kill him. The guard comes in and goes, "What happened?" And Martin's like, pretending that he was just asleep, like, I don't know what happened. And then Jerry, suddenly speaking very normally, goes, "I don't know. There was a jolt. And I feel like what I'm saying makes sense. Do I make sense to you?" So, Prodigal Son decided to take the stance that electroshock therapy is good for you. This is important to mention, but in the previous season of Prodigal Son, there's this whole thing with this weird self-help cult whose thing is giving people electric shocks, and they talk about how this is bad and a scam and terrible and not good for you and torture and all of this. But then, season 2, episode 1 goes, we've just fixed this man's brain by giving him an electric shock. And next we see Malcolm coming in to visit Martin, and Martin says that Jerry's not here anymore because he's off being treated, and he's on his way to being better because he's spoken to his doctors, and his doctors have decided to try him on rounds of electroshock therapy. Now, I am not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just your common and garden mentally ill person. And so I can't say whether or not electroshock therapy is always bad. It's not my place to say either. But my place is to point out that the problem here is not really using the electroshock therapy. The problem is using the electroshock therapy on someone who physically cannot consent to it. Now, I am aware that there are various things that do actually use electroshock therapy. People with dissociative issues use electroshock therapy. I mean, I believe Dodie many years ago, Dodie of YouTube and music fame, many years ago was talking about going through a similar thing through some of her mental health issues. However, Jerry, who could barely form sentences and seemed to be sort of stuck at this very childlike mentality, for whatever reason, because, again, when you write people as criminally insane, you kind of don't have to give them a proper diagnosis, you can just make them crazy in whatever way suits you, is that he would never be in a position to agree to electroshock therapy. And by Martin accidentally doing this, and accidentally, starting to cure this guy of whatever, it kind of puts forward the idea that we should just use experimental and vicious forms of therapy on people who can't agree to it because it's for their own good, which is bad, right? Anyway, that's the last I'm going to say about Jerry for the moment, because the sun is going down, and how I'm getting pretty dark because the sun is going down. Let me put a light on. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in this episode is its mentions of COVID. Now, it's an interesting choice, and I'm sure we'll be seeing it in a lot of TV shows going forward. of whether or not they'll choose to talk about the pandemic. I was a bit shocked that they talked about the pandemic, because the pandemic is a real world thing, and the Prodigal Son lives in this, it lives in crime world. It lives in a world where you can't move in New York for serial killers with a weird little serial killer quirk. And by having the pandemic happen in canon, it's just quite jarring. I've already mentioned that the idea that some criminally insane ex-surgeon could somehow stop the pandemic from ravaging a prison, when we know for a fact, by the way, that prisons are being hit the worst. There are hundreds of people who have died in prisons from COVID who hadn't even been charged yet. This is a problem across the world. This isn't just an American problem. And, it's an American show, but I'm a Brit, so I'm going to talk about things outside of America a little bit as well. But we have had problems in the UK, we've had problems globally with prisons being hit quite hard in the pandemic. So it's a little bit odd to have, magic serial killer with his magic medical powers just kind of stop that from happening in one specific prison is really odd, and it adds into the complete tonal mess of the show, because whilst it is really dark and gritty and all of these horrible gritty murders, it's living in this elevated space of crime world. But then pandemic brings it into a real horrible place. And yeah, this show's gritty and horrible, but it's still escapism, pure and simple. And you can't really have escapism if they talk about the things you're trying to escape from. This isn't necessarily a bad thing or a wrong thing to do, to mention the pandemic and to have people talk about how it's been a tough year for everyone. It's just weird in this show. And talking about something else that's really weird for this show to bring up is my final point of the video, ACAB, but not really. So, mentioned in the recap of the episode there that JT is subject of police profiling, police racism. Now, earlier in the episode, DC Powell talks about how, with everything going on and systemic racism, now is a really bad time to be a police officer. Kind of sitting there going, well then quit, darling. Do something else, my lovely. Go do something else. But she doesn't. She continues to be a police officer for whatever reason. And that would have been fine. Prodigal Son, the writers clearly decided that they did want to mention the big things that have gone on in the last year. And the big things that have gone on in this year are pandemic and protests against police brutality, systemic racism within the police force, particularly in the American police force, but this is not an American-only issue. But I'm not here to talk about that, really. What I'm here to talk about is the wishy-washiness of Prodigal Son's stance on this. Now, obviously, it is a police drama. You cannot have your police drama go, the police are bad, actually. If you had any kind of cojones at all, you might, but this one doesn't. So instead what it does is have a really quite unnecessarily triggering portrayal of police brutality on the one hand, and then immediately, in a room of 3 people of colour who are all police officers and a white profiler, you have the police chief, person of colour police chief, come in and say, not all cops are bad, actually, and you're a good cop. And the problem isn't systemic, the problem is individuals who have an issue. Which You can't have one character talk about how it's systemic and then have another character talk about how it isn't systemic, at least not without kind of pitting those against each other in a fair way, because it's not fair the way it's shown, and it feels very, very weird to have just watched a person of colour be pinned against the wall by his throat, being unable to breathe, which is obviously a very, very, very deliberate call to a specific part, well, not just one specific, but, you know, what happened to George Floyd? You know, the murder that kind of kicked all of the protests off. He couldn't breathe either. And it's very real in a way that nothing else in Prodigal Son really is. It's so real and so visceral and so horrible to watch. And, like, I'm a white person watching it, and I was made to feel quite uncomfortable. So I can't even begin to imagine what it would feel like being a person of colour watching that, especially a black person. It's an aggressive thing to do. It's an unkind thing to do as well. I think it is unfair to show something that is so deliberately calling on a very specific and real instance of police brutality, of murder by white policemen of a black person, of multiple people of colour, specifically black people, and to then turn around and go, no, but there are good cops despite what people say. It's just wishy-washy and flippant, and the tone is just wrong. And that's my problem overall with Prodigal Son, and specifically Prodigal Son Season 2, Episode 1, is that it is a tonal mess. Will I continue to watch this show? Absolutely, because I love a mess. I'm a huge fan of messes. But this episode in particular, it had big problems.